Hey YouTube, welcome back. I've got a new iteration of Devouring Orb for you. If you've seen any of my other videos here on YouTube, you know that I've played a lot of Devouring Orb in the past. So we're calling this build the Auto Miner Devouring Orb character. We are a non-crit, non-orbit Devouring Orb character. We are using a Bastion for an extra layer of defense. We don't have any crit on our gear. And the big thing that we gain from the new patch is a small 1x1 idol called Singularity. So this thing rolls between 8% and 20% more hit damage. You can't deal critical strikes. I don't think even the highest roll, which is 20%, I don't think Singularity is going to be something that enables new builds altogether. But there are a handful of builds in Last Epoch right now that have a hard time getting crit or getting base crit, or maybe they're squishy characters and they prefer to use a Bastion instead of using an offhand catalyst for crit. And what if we could just get a little bit of extra damage and then take out all of that investment into critical strike chance? So normally if you were playing Devouring Orb, if you wanted to go crit, you'd probably be using an offhand catalyst, which means you don't have a shield. So Void Knight, one of my favorite masteries, has a ton of damage in it baked into the mastery itself, and then all the skills deal a ton of damage. But you don't really have much in terms of defense. What you could do is use a Bastion and try to get your base critical strike chance somewhere else. You could use a Locket of the Forgotten Knight, but that's a set item and it has an opportunity cost of not being a unique, not being legendary, not being an exalted item. Or you could use a Prismatic Gaze, and I don't know about you, but I have a really hard time finding LP Prismatic Gazes. And then even then, if you find a legendary Prismatic Gaze helmet with a plus critical strike chance on it, it might not be a 4 because it rolls between 2 and 4 critical strike chance. And then you need to put Devouring Orb on it, and like maybe it's 1 LP and it doesn't also have Vitality on it. So there's a lot that goes into getting enough critical strike chance in a Devouring Orb build. And in thinking about that, you know, Devouring Orb is probably a pretty good place to be in terms of experimenting with characters that have a hard time getting enough critical strike chance. What if we just took out all of that investment, invested into quality of life, cooldown recovery speed, defenses instead, and just had enough damage? Let me walk you through this character and show you kind of what's going on here. So let's give you a quick rundown of how the character looks. You can see at the clips at the beginning of this what it looks like, but I'll show you how we're actually playing the character. So we're going to basically numlock, or for me, because I don't have numlock, we're just going to hold down the buttons on our keyboard. We're going to numlock our Anomaly and our Devouring Orb, and then we're going to cast our Sigils of Hope at the beginning of an Echo, hit Volatile Reversal, and then run. So instead of like a normal Devouring Orb character, where you have the Orbit node, where these where the Devouring Orbs are following you on your character, we don't have a movement skill on our character. You could unspec Sigils if you wanted to and spec into Lunge, but I think for this character, what you'd like to do is numlock these two things, get your Sigils spun up, and then kind of have your mouse in front of your character as you're running, because as you're walking forward, you're going to be spawning once every second, because it's a 1 second cooldown, which is kind of insane. You're going to be spawning the Devouring Orbs in front of your character. And then if you need some extra damage, quite frankly, you can just like walk up to an enemy and pop Volatile Reversal. Because remember, when you hit Volatile Reversal, it's also going to apply enemies take % increased damage. And then it'll move your character backward and it'll give you some nice spacing while the rest of your damage happens. But where this build really shines is the moment that you start standing still. So when you're doing a beacon, when you're doing a boss, when you're doing some kind of event at the end of your your Echo in a Monolith, this build pops off super hard because all of a sudden you're spawning 1 Devouring Orb every second. It looks like 1.5, but we get cooldown from Anomaly. So let's go ahead and click Anomaly. Now it's 1.2, and then we have Inspiration that we gain here, which gives us extra cooldown recovery speed. So it gets down to a 1 second cooldown on Devouring Orb, and each of those is spawning the Abyssal Orbs as well. And then each of those are applying Shred, and then you have whatever you choose for your single target. We'll talk about that in a moment. And it's plenty of damage to clear everything in the game, while making room for Quicksilver, which means we always have haste, making room for a Bastion of Honor, making room for Aurora's Time Glass, and Aurora Time Glass obviously works very well with Ravenous Void here. So that's what the build is doing. Let me walk you through the gearing, the skills themselves, the masteries, and then we'll talk a little bit more about some of the decisions that we made about the build along the way. So let's go through our skills. I'm going to leave Smite for the very end because I'm going to recommend to you a different single target skill, but we'll get there. So first things first is Devouring Orb. In the previous Devouring Orb builds that I've always played, I would take one node that lessens my duration, and then I would basically grab as much more damage as I can with Rotting Prey, and then the Abyssal Orb frequency on the far right of the tree. The reason that you wouldn't want to take both the Orbit and the Cataclysm node is that they both have minus duration on them. So if you have minus duration on both of these, then you're not spawning very many Abyssal Orbs, and you don't really have a good source of damage, right? Because your Devouring Orb just doesn't last very long, so it doesn't get to do much. So when the Cataclysm event happens, at the end of the duration of the Devouring Orb, it goes and like kind of rains down a little shower of purple like this. That does not shotgun. It would be crazy cool if it did, but it doesn't. So reducing our duration in order to make Cataclysm happen more often is not a good place to be. Instead of being an auto bomber, we're an auto miner. We're placing these things down in front of us. And the reason we're doing that is to grab this node in the very bottom right, which has 150% cooldown recovery speed. So this isn't a build that spawns a Devouring Orb once every second, and then each of those spawns an Abyssal Orb. We have a more damage multiplier over here. We've got a little bit of penetration, but then we also have Armor Shred and Void Shred and our single target skill that go into juicing up our damage. So that's what our first skill tree looks like over here. We have +3. If we didn't have +3, we'd probably just trim around the edges. Maybe trim one more multiplier over here, one cooldown recovery speed, and maybe one Abyssal Orb frequency. I think that would be my approach if I didn't have the full +3 on my helmet. Next up is Anomaly. There's not too much to talk about here, so we're just going to breeze through it. The opportunity cost for being a crit build is to spec 5 points into Decimation, which gives us 30 increased crit per point. So by saving 5 points down here, instead we're going to invest all 3 points into cooldown recovery speed, which affects Anomaly itself, by the way, so we have permanent Anomaly. We also put our extra point into a cast speed, and all of our points into Leech and Leech rate across the top. Next up is Volatile Reversal. Because we are a Singularity build, and Singularity has like more hit damage, we're trying to do things that just have as much hit damage as possible. So even though you might consider putting enemies take increased damage over time over here, I'm going to recommend not, because the majority of your damage is non-crit hit-based damage, not damage over time. So we're going to spec 3 points into the bottom left for enemies take % increased damage. Remember the shotguns, so if you hit enemies with both of these, then you're applying this twice, so you're getting enemies take 60% increased damage. And then we have a whole bunch of cast speed, movement speed, and some extra cooldown on the bottom side as well. For sigils, we are using a Bastion of Honor, but I think we're tanky enough, so I've opted not into taking the extra block chance nodes in the top right here. But instead, my recommendation for you is 5 points in armor, because 800 flat armor is a lot. Wait, 8 before? 8? Yeah, 8? 8. 800 flat armor is a ton of armor to get for free here. So I'm going to recommend this, sigils on kill, some extra fire damage, and then everything is converted to void up with this node here. So for the last skill, I'm currently using Smite, but I'm going to recommend to you using Abyssal Echoes. Let's talk about the difference between these two things. For Smite, if you're double casting it manually, this double cast does not get echoed, so maybe you consider speccing this differently. Maybe you could spec into the more damage points here, but the double cast still feels pretty good just for getting some extra clear. Or some extra hits against the enemy, right? Because you get like applied shred and armor shred and whatnot. For Smite, there's a couple things to think about. After you get a couple stacks of shred, because Smite hits and Abyssal Echoes does not hit, the individual smites will be doing about 18,000 damage, which is about the same as one single proc of Abyssal Echoes. So Abyssal Echoes has no cooldown, or sorry, has a cooldown to it, the way that you would spec it, but Smite has no cooldown. So what's the big difference here? Well, your Devouring Orb has a 1 second cooldown, and you're also numlocking Anomaly. So you're spending a lot of time, first of all, moving and avoiding mechanics, and also you're casting Devouring Orb and you're casting Anomaly pretty often. So if you're going for a cast speed spec and you want Smite to deal as much damage as possible, yes, it's better than Abyssal Echoes because it's a hit and it benefits from Singularity, but I think that's being too much of a slave to the theme of being a hit-based non-crit build. That said, Smite does feel good because it doesn't cost mana when you're using a wand, because your wand has a -3 mana cost implicit modifier to it. So not casting mana, not costing mana is why I'm using it right now. And it's fine. It feels comfortable to use, but it is, strictly speaking, a bit less damage and a bit less quality of life in terms of how often you need to cast the skill than Abyssal Echoes is. So we just have a bunch of more damage multipliers here and some more damage against ignited enemies, but this gets converted to slow, so it's more damage against slowed enemies. So if you were to use your Abyssal Echoes instead, let's go ahead and pull this up on the second screen here. So Abyssal Echoes, I would recommend speccing it this way. The benefit of Abyssal Echoes is that it does have a cooldown, so you can cast it once, and then you can cast your Devouring Orb once per second and continue having that mobility as you move around the map and avoiding boss mechanics. So the normal things that you would see here are the nodes up to have five total casts. So it'd be like 18,000 times 5 with all other things held constant. And then a couple nodes into duration, and then only 2 into spell void damage. You have a ton of vitality in this build. This is a normal vitality scaling spell caster Void Knight, which means all of your spells have +2 spell void damage per point of vitality. So not only do we get a bunch of life of vitality, but we also get a flat damage as well. A couple points up here for more damage from Echoed Cast, because we have 40% Echo chance from Mastery, and then we have these extra Echoes here as well. I think the better place overall is to be Abyssal Echoes. It doesn't benefit from Singularity, having more hit-based non-crit damage to your build, but I think it's like a better skill to slot into your single target setup here. But I'm using Smite because it costs no mana, and I like spamming it. So it just it's a better feel for me. Honorable mention for Smite as well. You could trim a handful of points here, and instead of speccing the 2 points in Pillars of Light, you could spec the 2 points in Blinding Flash, and go 1, 2, 3, 4, and just spec 4 points into having some extra AoE. So Smite by default only hits one enemy, but if you grab these extra nodes over here, this would be a nice way of getting some extra AoE when you are casting Smite. 2 things to say about this if you are going to go this route. This adds a mana cost, so instead of being 3 minus 3, which is 0, it'd be a mana cost of 5. So if you do that, I would recommend putting 3 points into Time and Faith, which means that it's effectively free and it actually nets you 1 mana when you cast your Smite. So that's my first recommendation. The second thing to note, which is not so much a recommendation, is that these lightning bolts are not converted to void. So this is a nice way of getting extra hits. They still scale off spell damage. They still scale off most of the things you have going on. They apply shred and whatnot, but it doesn't scale with the word void because it doesn't get converted. Maybe EHG, the developers, change this in the future. I've spoken to a dev about this. They're interested in perhaps making this void damage as well, but you should know that even if the rest of your Smite is void, this currently in patch 085 is not. It's only lightning damage. That said, let's blow through the mastery here. If you played a handful of Sentinel builds in the past, this is going to look very, very familiar to you, and there's not too much spice going on. If you like putting 1-pointers into block, then you can go ahead and do those, but that's just kind of your own style. We're going to grab all the points for Vitality across the Sentinel tree and the Void Knight tree, because Vitality is our own life, and it's also a source of our flat damage. So looking at Void Knight, we are not doing anything with crit, so crit multi doesn't really help us. We have a bunch of points into flat damage for our spells. We have some Vitality across the top, some Vitality in percent health, Echo Chance, Echo Chance, Echo Chance, and some extra movement speed here. So there's really not too much to talk about. If you haven't seen a Void Knight before, this is some pretty common stuff. If you were a melee build, maybe you're speccing differently, but honestly, for whenever I play a Void Knight, these are some pretty common nodes altogether. And this is pretty much what I would be thinking about whenever I start playing a Void Knight. Clicking on Paladin, we're going up the middle. We're not using any kind of physical damage or fire penetration, so just some extra elemental resistance to make our gearing easier, some extra life, some extra endurance, and maybe a handful of points in necrotic resistance just to make the rest of your gearing process easier. So that is our skills and our mastery. Let's talk about the gear itself here. For the gear, you're going to notice that we don't have any crit across any of our gear. And then we're also using a Bastion, which means we also have no base critical strike chance, right? So because we're not crit, what do we get to do? Well, we get to use things like a Quicksilver Coil. If I had different gear, I would be using this Quicksilver Coil instead, because it has 110% increased damage for my character on it. So this is the kind of thing that I would like to use because I'm not using lunge. I don't have a movement skill, and normally I have about 88 movement speed, and then when I proc my my volatile reversal, it goes up to like 122 movement speed, and that feels pretty good for me. So I would recommend a Quicksilver Coil or some sort of haste for your build if you're choosing to not use lunge like I am. So we're using Ravenous Void because it has 15% generic less damage taken, which is excellent. It also has Vitality, which is both offense and defense for us, and some percent health. But what you should know for patch 085 is if you go below your threshold, if you proc your Ravenous Void, you are going to lose health leech for a short duration. But most importantly, Mimic Hunger is an ailment, which means if you're using a belt, which you should be, that has cleanse all ailments on potion use, when you get to low health, you just use a potion and the downside of not being able to leech disappears. But you should know about that. So just make sure you know what's in the patch notes, right? For the rest of our gear here, I have a bit of cast speed built in my character, and you might be thinking to yourself, why are we using cast speed when our Devouring Orb sits on the ground and it casts Abyssal Orbs for us, and those Abyssal Orbs don't scale on cast speed? So here's the reason that we have cast speed on Auroras, which is convenient up here. We also have cast speed here and on the Implicit, and we have a bit of cast speed down here. I think what I'd like to do is Exalted cast speed on the wand and then remove the cast speed down here, but that's just like a little bit of min-max there. The reason for cast speed is, well, we're numlocking Devouring Orb and we're casting it once a second. If you don't have cast speed on your character, it's going to feel a little bit clunky. And you're going to feel like this character is a bit more of a mess than you're willing to put up with. So getting some cast speed on a wand, getting like one good Exalted cast speed roll on your wand itself is a great place to be. Getting the Exalted cast speed on the wand is important because you can get spell damage and cast speed on your wand, but you cannot get void damage. So we're going to get spell damage and void damage on our relic, and then we'll get that one big cast speed roll that we're looking for on our wand instead. For our gear, we're looking for as much vitality as possible. Obviously, like tier 7 vitality would be insane, and then just as much health as you can get. For our belt, we want percent health, hybrid health, maybe a little bit of mana regeneration. For me, I like putting mana regen on the belt. It's a nice place to be. And just that cleanse ailments. And then again, vitality, movement speed, hybrid life, as much life as you can jam into this character here. So let me hover over these last couple pieces of gear so you can see what my gear looks like. Next up is idols, and then we'll chat about blessings real quick. For idols, you could go for a normal setup with 1x2s just to get like vitality fizz res, vitality necrotic res, vitality thing, and just get like as much vitality out of this as possible. That's a good place to be, and if you're trying to meme it up and get to 100 vitality, that's the way to do it. What we're doing instead is getting a bit of vitality plus armor shred chance. So this is my only armor shred that I currently have, because otherwise I would need it on gloves or on my amulet. So because I'm using unique items that are hard to find LP on, I'm getting my armor shred instead from one of these idols over here. Mana efficiency with the void skills is a great place to be. Let me show you my mana cost real quick. I'm basically numlocking my anomaly and my Devouring Orb, so we're at 17 and 15. If I took off my mana efficiency with the void skills, let's see, what was it? It was 17 and 15. It goes up to 19 and 17. So it saves me a 2 mana cost on each of those. And I think that's a great place to be. It's worth noting it also works on sigils, but every time you cast a sigil, you're probably using volatile reversal afterward, so that doesn't matter too much. But for these 2 numlocks, it does feel very good, especially if you're planning on using your Abyssal Echoes, because Abyssal Echoes, it's a better place to be in terms of damage, but it's not free mana cost. So having that mana efficiency goes a long way in making Abyssal Echoes feel like a better single target solution altogether for this build, if damage is the only thing you care about. Last up to discuss is the blessings themselves. We hit a tremendous amount of times, so having the void shred here is tremendously helpful for us. We like this a lot. One of the purposes of playing this build as non-crit is getting to use a high damage mastery with these high damage skills, but also have a bit of defense as well. So all my Void Knight characters ends up using a Bastion because I think it's just like a really nice pairing together. So with Bastion, we also have a block effect blessing from Hayrot and the level 90 monolith, and then some endurance, some all resistance. You really want all resistance here instead of crit avoid because you get so much crit avoid just from using the right base types as a Sentinel build. So you get Crit Avoid here. Hopefully you would get Crit Avoid in your helmet as well. And then maybe one good Crit Avoid blessing somewhere, or one good Crit Avoid roll on your gear somewhere would be enough to cap your crit avoidance. If I had Crit Avoid on my helmet base as well, like a new Solarum helmet, then I would not need to use this ring, and I would instead go for like a double damage Quicksilver ring instead. So that about covers the build and the decisions that we made into it. I am thrilled that there is a new way of playing Devouring Orb. I've never seen anyone play Devouring Orb like this before. It's kind of like numlocking the non-orbit playstyle. I'm so happy that like my favorite skill in the game, Devouring Orb, not only does it have like, you know, the normal way of playing it, or you can use it as a support skill to go along with the damage over time Abyssal Echo build, but there's another way of playing it, and that just makes me so happy. So we're going to keep poking around with Singularity. We're going to see if we can find new ways of playing some non-crit builds. Maybe we'll play non-crit Spell Earthquake, because that's, you know, a high damage skill that has a hard time getting critical strike chance as well. But we'll see what other things we can come up with, because Singularity, I don't think it's going to make me, I don't think it's going to create new builds in Last Epoch, but I do think it's just like a fun thing to do if you want to work more quality of life or work more defense into these builds that already have a bunch of damage, and maybe you don't need 20 million DPS. Maybe you can just have like, you know, a couple 100,000, suffice with your Singularity, with your more hit damage here, and then just like build other things on those item slots instead. So that's it for the build. If you have questions about it, if you want to see it in person, you can always drop by Twitch at twitch.tv/PayerThePig. Otherwise, you can just ask questions here in the comment section of the video, and I'll do my best to respond to those as well. So thanks for being here. I appreciate it, and I'll see you next time.